A poor student helped an old man cross the street, never guessing he was her long-lost grandpa. The words echoed in Ellie's mind as she stared at the headline of her university's social media post, her own face smiling back at her in a blurry photo someone had snapped without her knowledge. Fame wasn't what she had sought when she'd stopped to help the elderly gentleman at that busy intersection last week. It had been instinct, nothing more, a momentary kindness in a life that had shown her precious little of it. Rain pattered against the cracked window of her tiny studio apartment, the sound amplifying the emptiness inside. Ellie pulled her threadbare sweater tighter, ignoring the growl of her stomach. 3 more days until her next paycheck. 3 more days of ramen noodles and tap water, of calculating each penny and praying the electricity wouldn't be cut off before she could make another payment. She closed her laptop, unable to bear reading the comments beneath the post, well-meaning strangers praising her for basic human decency. If they knew how close she was to dropping out, how many nights she cried herself to sleep wondering if any of this struggle was worth it. Ellie shivered, but not from the cold. 22 years old and completely alone in the world. Her mother gone 8 years now, cancer stealing her with cruel efficiency. No father, at least none that had ever claimed her. No extended family that cared enough to answer her desperate letters when the foster system had swallowed her whole at 14. The rain intensified, drumming an angry rhythm that matched her pulse. Ellie glanced at the stack of textbooks on her makeshift desk, a wooden door balanced on milk crates, and the pile of past due notices beside them. Physics wouldn't study itself. Her scholarship covered tuition but little else, and her part-time job at the campus coffee shop barely paid for this closet of an apartment. She pressed her palms against her eyes, willing the tears back. Crying never solved anything. Her mother had taught her that in those final months, smiling through pain Ellie couldn't imagine. "One foot in front of the other, sunshine," she whispered, her mother's favorite encouragement becoming her own prayer over the years. Morning arrived with thin, watery light that did little to dispel the chill in her bones. Ellie moved through her routine mechanically, shower with lukewarm water, hair still damp under her knit cap, a granola bar she'd saved from her last shift broken into 2 pieces, half for now, half for lunch. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror looked hollow, dark circles under eyes that had once sparkled with what her mother called the light of possibility. The campus came alive around her as she walked to her first class, students laughing, complaining about assignments, planning weekend parties. Separate universes that occasionally brushed against her own, but never truly connected. Ellie had learned to be invisible, to move through spaces unnoticed. It was easier that way. Fewer questions about her past, her family, her future. Professor Winter's physics lecture droned on, equations blurring before Ellie's eyes. She hadn't slept well, the gnawing ache of hunger keeping her awake until exhaustion had finally pulled her under near dawn. The pencil trembled in her fingers as she tried to take notes. "Miss James?" The professor's voice cut through her fog. "Perhaps you'd care to demonstrate the solution to this problem." 20 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Panic rose in her throat as she stared at the incomprehensible symbols on the board. She hadn't been following, had missed whatever explanation he'd given. I'm sorry, Professor. I don't..." His disappointed sigh cut deeper than any reprimand. "See me after class, please." The remaining 40 minutes stretched endlessly, each second a small humiliation as she felt her classmates' curious glances. When the bell finally rang, Ellie approached his desk with leaden feet. "Your last quiz was concerning, Miss James." Professor Winters removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "And today you seem distracted." "I'm sorry, sir. I've been..." What could she say? That she was working 30 hours a week and still couldn't make ends meet? That she sometimes chose between electricity and food? That she was so tired she could barely remember her own name? "Your scholarship is contingent on maintaining a 3.5 GPA, he reminded her unnecessarily. "You're currently hovering at a 3.2 in my class." "I know. I'll do better. I promise." The words felt hollow even as she spoke them. His expression softened slightly. "Is everything all right, Ellie? You were one of my brightest students last semester." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. "Everything's fine," she lied, the practiced response automatic. "Just a little under the weather. I'll catch up." Outside, the November wind cut through her inadequate jacket, a hand-me-down from the donation bin at her last foster home. Winter in Massachusetts was merciless, especially for someone without proper clothing. She had 20 minutes to cross campus for her shift at the coffee shop, just enough time if she hurried. The intersection at Commonwealth Avenue was busy as always, students and professors rushing between buildings, cars honking impatience at pedestrians who dared to slow them down. Ellie waited for the light, bouncing slightly to keep warm, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. That's when she saw him. An elderly man stood at the corner, clutching a worn leather briefcase with gnarled fingers. His coat, once fine but now showing its age just like its owner, hung slightly askew on his thin frame. Silver hair whipped about his face in the wind as he peered at the crossing signal with obvious confusion. He took one hesitant step forward, then retreated as a car sped past, horn blaring. Something about his uncertainty, the slight tremble in his stance, pulled at Ellie. Before she could reconsider, she was moving toward him. "Excuse me, sir? Would you like some help crossing?" He turned, roomy blue eyes meeting hers with surprise and something else, a flicker of emotion she couldn't name. For a moment he simply stared, and Ellie wondered if he'd heard her over the traffic noise. "That's very kind," he finally said, his voice a gentle rasp that somehow cut through the urban cacophony. "These intersections get more confusing every year. Or perhaps it's just these old eyes of mine." Ellie smiled, offering her arm. "I'm heading this way anyway." His hand, when it settled in the crook of her elbow, was surprisingly warm despite the cold. They waited for the pedestrian signal, an odd pair amid the rushing students with their headphones and hurried strides. "Are you a student here?" he asked, nodding toward the university buildings. "Physics major," she replied. "Second year? Physics." His face brightened. "The language of the universe. I always found comfort in its certainties, its elegant equations. Even when everything else in life proves unreliable, E still equals mc squared." The light changed, and she guided him carefully off the curb, matching her pace to his measured steps. "You studied physics?" she asked, curious despite her hurry. "Taught it, actually. Many years ago now." A wistful smile crossed his weathered face. "At this very university, though the buildings were fewer then, and the students dressed rather differently." They reached the opposite curb just as the signal began flashing its warning. Ellie should have continued on. She'd be late for her shift now, but something held her there. "I should introduce myself properly," the old man said, releasing her arm to extend his hand. "I'm Thomas. Thomas Carraway." "Ellie James." She shook his hand, noting the liver spots and pronounced veins, yet feeling the surprising strength in his grip. "Well, Miss Ellie James, you've done your good deed for the day. I won't keep you from your busy schedule." He glanced at his wristwatch, an antique timepiece that seemed to match him perfectly. "Though if you ever want to discuss physics with an old professor, I still remember enough to be dangerous." Ellie smiled, the first genuine one in days. "Actually, I could use some help. I'm struggling in advanced theoretical physics with Professor Winters." "Winters?" Thomas's eyebrows rose. "Harold Winters? You know him?" "He was one of my students, 30 years ago now." Thomas chuckled. "Brilliant but utterly lacking in teaching ability, if I recall correctly. Has that changed?" "Not really," Ellie admitted, then glanced at her watch. "I'm sorry, I have to run. I'm already late for work." Of course. He nodded, then hesitated. "Perhaps—" "No, I shouldn't impose." "What is it?" she asked, already backing away. "I was going to suggest we could meet sometime. I could help you with your studies. A sort of thank you for your kindness today." He waved a dismissive hand. "But you're busy, I'm sure." The offer was tempting, more than tempting. But strangers didn't just help without wanting something in return. That was a lesson life had taught her repeatedly. "I don't know." "The library," he said quickly. "Public place. Tuesday afternoon, perhaps? I walk by campus most days anyway. It would give these old legs somewhere purposeful to go." Something in his eyes, a loneliness that mirrored her own, made the decision for her. Tuesday, 3 o'clock. First floor of the science library. Ellie took another step backward. "I really have to go now." "Tuesday," he confirmed with a nod. "Don't be late, Miss James. Punctuality is the politeness of kings and the obligation of physics students." She laughed despite herself and turned to hurry away, not seeing the way Thomas Carraway stared after her, his hand reaching for something inside his coat pocket, an old, faded photograph he'd carried for 20 years. The coffee shop hummed with pre-exam energy, students hunched over laptops, the air thick with the scent of espresso and anxiety. Ellie tied her apron with practiced movements, ignoring her manager's pointed look at the clock. "Sorry, Diane. I stopped to help someone cross the street." The Good Samaritan routine won't pay the bills, honey. Diane's tone was gentle despite her words. She'd taken a liking to Ellie, sometimes slipping her leftover pastries at closing time, though I did see that post about you, going viral as our local hero. Ellie's cheeks warmed. It wasn't anything special. Kindness is always special. Diane handed her a blueberry muffin. Eat this before you start. You're looking pale again. The muffin was heaven, and Ellie forced herself to eat slowly, savoring each bite as she watched the afternoon crowd through the serving window. That's when she saw him again, Thomas Carraway, sitting alone at a corner table, staring into a cup of black coffee with such concentration he might have been reading tea leaves. He seemed smaller somehow, without his coat, shoulders slightly hunched under a cardigan that had seen better decades. The leather briefcase sat beside him, one hand resting protectively upon it. "Who's the old-timer?" Diane asked, following her gaze. "The man I helped across the street." Ellie brushed crumbs from her fingers. "He used to teach physics here, apparently. Well, he ordered just a small coffee an hour ago and hasn't budged since. Maybe you should check if he needs anything else?" Ellie approached his table, notepad in hand, though she didn't need it. "Can I get you anything else, Professor Carraway?" He looked up, momentary confusion crossing his features before recognition dawned. "Miss James, I didn't realize you worked here." "Just part-time." She gestured to his nearly empty cup. "Refill? Please." He pushed the cup toward her. "And perhaps, do you serve food here? I find I'm rather hungry, but nothing too elaborate. The tomato soup is good. Comes with a grilled cheese sandwich." He nodded appreciatively. "Perfect. Winter food for a winter day." When she returned with his order, she found him leafing through a worn physics textbook, margins filled with meticulous notations in faded blue ink. "Still keeping up with the field?" she asked, setting down his food. "Trying to—" He closed the book. "Though I admit some of the newer theories leave me scratching my head. Quantum computing wasn't even a gleam in science's eye when I was teaching." A lull in customers gave Ellie the chance to linger. "How long did you teach here?" 42 years. Pride tinged his voice. "Arrived as a young assistant professor in 1959, retired in 2001. Would have stayed longer, but life had other plans." He said this last part with a heaviness that suggested a story, but Ellie didn't pry. Everyone had their burdens. "What made you choose physics?" he asked, blowing gently on a spoonful of soup. The question caught her off guard. Most people asked about her job prospects or whether she found the math difficult. Few asked about her motivation. "The stars," she answered truthfully. "My mother and I used to lie in this field behind our apartment building on clear nights. She'd point out constellations, make up stories about them. When I asked how they stayed up there, why they moved the way they did, she bought me a children's book about gravity and orbits. The memory warmed her more than any heater could. I was hooked. Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. The past tense hung between them. Thomas set down his spoon. "I'm sorry. Recently? 8 years ago." Ellie busied herself wiping an already clean table nearby. "Cancer. And your father?" "Never in the picture." She shrugged, the practiced nonchalance of someone who'd answered this question countless times. Thomas nodded slowly, something unreadable passing across his features. "Well, I imagine she would be very proud of you now. Physics at Lakeview University is no small achievement." "Maybe." Ellie bit her lip. "If I can stay in the program." Before he could inquire further, the afternoon rush began, classes letting out, students seeking caffeine and sugar to fuel their study sessions. By the time things slowed again, Thomas had gone, leaving a generous tip and a note scrawled on a napkin. Tuesday, 3 p.m. Bring your most challenging problems. TC. The days until Tuesday passed in a blur of work shifts, classes, and futile attempts to understand the material that would be on her upcoming physics exam. Ellie's apartment grew colder as she tried to conserve heating, wearing layers of clothes to bed and huddling under every blanket she owned. The forecast promised snow by week's end, early for November, but not unheard of in New England. When Tuesday arrived, she found herself strangely nervous as she pushed through the heavy doors of the science library. The familiar smell of books and the hushed atmosphere usually calmed her, but today her heart beat a rapid rhythm against her ribs. What if he didn't come? What if he did but couldn't actually help? What if this was all some elaborate setup for disappointment? But there he was, at a table near the windows, sunlight casting a golden halo around his silver hair. The leather briefcase occupied the chair beside him, and several textbooks were already open before him. "Right on time," he greeted her, checking his antique watch. Excellence begins with punctuality. Ellie slid into the seat across from him, removing her battered notebook from her backpack. Thank you for doing this. I don't want to waste your time. Time spent sharing knowledge is never wasted, my dear. He tapped one of the open books. Now show me what's troubling you in Winter's class. For the next 2 hours, Thomas Carraway patiently walked her through concepts that had seemed impenetrable in lecture. His explanations were clear, filled with real-world analogies that suddenly made abstract theories concrete. Occasionally he'd pause, lost in thought, before scribbling an equation or diagram that illuminated the problem from an entirely new angle. "You're a natural teacher," Ellie said as she successfully completed a problem that had stumped her for days. Thomas smiled, a hint of melancholy in his eyes. "It was my life's work. Some talents never leave us, even when everything else does." There it was again, that suggestion of loss, of a story untold. Ellie hesitated, then asked, "Did you have a family? Children who followed in your academic footsteps?" The question hung between them, and for a moment she thought she'd overstepped. Thomas's hand moved to his pocket, fingers brushing something hidden there. "I had a daughter," he said finally, voice soft. "Brilliant girl, creative in ways I never was. She was studying art history when she met a young man, a musician with big dreams and very little sense." His smile was bittersweet. "I disapproved. Strongly. We argued and, well, she chose him." "I'm sorry," Ellie offered, recognizing the weight of estrangement in his words. "I was rigid," Thomas continued almost to himself, "too concerned with stability, security, things a physics professor values. I couldn't see that she needed to find her own path." He straightened, clearing his throat. "In any case, that was long ago. We lost touch. She passed away some years back." "And her husband? The musician?" "Left before my granddaughter was born." His fingers tightened around a pencil. "I tried to find them afterward, but my daughter, she made it difficult. Changed her name, moved frequently. By the time I learned of her passing, my granddaughter had disappeared into the foster system." The pencil snapped in his grip. Thomas stared at the broken pieces with surprise, as if they had betrayed him. "I'm still looking," he said, voice barely audible. "Every day I look." Something cold slipped down Ellie's spine. Not fear, but a strange recognition she couldn't place. Before she could respond, her phone alarm chimed. Her evening shift started in 20 minutes. "I have to go," she said, gathering her notes. "Thank you again for your help. This makes so much more sense now." Thomas seemed to shake himself from his reverie. "Same time Thursday? We could review before your exam." "That would be amazing." Ellie hesitated, then added, "And maybe I could buy you coffee afterward? As thanks?" His smile transformed his entire face, erasing years of worry lines. "I'd like that very much, Miss James." As she hurried across campus, Ellie found herself thinking about Thomas's lost granddaughter. How old would she be now? What had happened to her in the system? Had she ever known about the grandfather who was still searching for her? The questions followed her through her shift, through the walk home in bitter cold, through her meager dinner of microwave soup. That night she dreamed of stars falling like snow, of her mother's laugh, of warm hands guiding her across busy streets. Thursday's session proved even more productive than Tuesday's. Thomas had prepared additional practice problems, anticipating areas where Ellie might struggle on the exam. His teaching style reminded her of her mother's patience, the way she'd explain things multiple times without frustration until Ellie understood. As promised, they went for coffee afterward, not at Ellie's workplace, but at a small cafe near the edge of campus that Thomas favored. "They still make things the old-fashioned way here," he explained as rich coffee aroma enveloped them. "No fancy machines, just care and attention." Over steaming mugs and shared slices of apple pie, my treat, Thomas had insisted, their conversation drifted from physics to literature, music, art, subjects Ellie rarely had time to indulge in anymore. "You have an old soul," Thomas observed as she discussed her love for classical music. "Most students your age prefer more energetic entertainment." "My mother loved Tchaikovsky," Ellie said. "We didn't have much, but we had this ancient record player and a few vinyl albums she'd found at yard sales. On bad days, when she was too sick to get out of bed, I'd play the Nutcracker Suite. It always made her smile even at the end." Thomas's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee. "What was her name?" "Your mother, Eleanor." Ellie traced the rim of her mug. "I'm Eleanor too, actually. Eleanor Rose James. But she always called me Ellie." "Eleanor Rose," he repeated softly. "A beautiful name." She said it was a family name. From her mother. Ellie shrugged. I never met any of my grandparents, though. Mom didn't talk about her family much. A strange expression crossed Thomas's face, a mixture of pain and something else. Hope, perhaps, or fear. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it, reaching instead for his ever-present briefcase. I have something for you, he said, removing a book bound in faded blue cloth. My personal copy of Feynman's lectures. It helped me through many difficult concepts in my student days. I can't accept this, Ellie protested, even as her fingers itched to open its pages. It must be valuable to you. Books are meant to be read, knowledge passed on. He pushed it gently across the table. Consider it a loan if you prefer. Return it when you've finished your degree. The gesture touched her deeply, not just the book itself, but the confidence in her success implied by his words. When they parted that evening, Ellie felt lighter somehow, as if more than just physics problems had been solved during their sessions. Winter arrived in earnest the following week, a blizzard sweeping through Massachusetts with merciless intensity. Classes were canceled, but Ellie's apartment building lost heat, pipes freezing in the pre-dawn hours. She woke to her breath forming clouds above her bed, the cold so profound it seemed alive, a presence creeping through every crack and crevice. Wrapping herself in every layer she owned, she tried the building manager's number, but it went straight to voicemail. The coffee shop had closed for the weather emergency. The dormitories required student IDs she didn't have. With nowhere to go and temperatures dropping dangerously, Ellie felt panic rising in her throat. Almost without conscious thought, she found herself dialing the number Thomas had given her, in case you have any questions before the exam. It rang 4 times, and she was about to hang up when his voice answered, gruff with concern. Ellie, are you all right? I'm sorry to bother you, she began, teeth chattering. There's no heat in my building, and I don't know where to go. I tried the emergency shelters, but they're full, and where are you now? The sharpness in his tone surprised her. My apartment. 1842 Westfield Street, apartment 3C. Stay put. I'm sending a car service. They'll bring you to my home. It should arrive in 15 minutes. I can't impose like that. This isn't a debate, young lady. People die in weather like this. Pack whatever you need for a few days. Before she could argue further, he had ended the call. True to his word, a car arrived 14 minutes later, the driver helping her navigate the treacherous sidewalk to the warmth of the back seat. Thomas lived in an old Victorian house in a quiet neighborhood that had probably been fashionable half a century ago. Now it stood like a dignified dowager among more modern homes, its gingerbread trim and bay windows speaking of another era. Light glowed from within, golden against the swirling white of the storm. The door opened before she could knock, Thomas ushering her inside with concerned efficiency. Straight through to the living room. Fire's going. There's tea on the side table. The house smelled of old books, furniture polish, and something baking, ordinary scents rendered extraordinary by their simple comfort. The living room was a professor's sanctuary, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, worn leather furniture, a desk positioned to catch morning light through the bay window, and as promised, a fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth reaching for her like an embrace. Your coat, Thomas prompted, helping her remove the inadequate jacket. He frowned at the thinness of it, at the multiple sweaters layered beneath. Good heavens, child, this wouldn't keep a sparrow warm. It's all I have, she admitted, the heat of the fire making her realize just how cold she'd been. Her fingers tingled painfully as circulation returned. Thomas disappeared with her coat, returning moments later with a thick woolen blanket that he draped around her shoulders. Sit. Drink your tea. There's honey if you want it sweeter. Ellie sank into an armchair that seemed to mold itself to her body, cradling the teacup between still trembling hands. The first sip spread warmth through her chest, loosening something tight within her. Thank you, she whispered, suddenly overwhelmed by the simple kindness of shelter, of warmth freely given. Thomas settled in the chair opposite, studying her with an intensity that might have been uncomfortable, if not for the genuine concern behind it. How long has your heat been out? Since this morning. But it's an old building. It's never really warm. And your landlord? Says repairs cost money, and if I want better accommodations, I should pay higher rent. She sipped her tea, embarrassed by the admission of her circumstances. Unconscionable, Thomas muttered. And how long have you been living there? Since I started at Lakeview. It's all I can afford on what I make at the coffee shop. She'd never spoken so openly about her financial struggles, but something about Thomas's direct questions made evasion seem pointless. And your scholarship? Doesn't it provide for housing? Tuition only. I was lucky to get that. Ellie set down her cup, suddenly self-conscious. I'm sorry. You didn't invite me here to complain about my problems. I invited you here because no one should freeze in a blizzard, Thomas said firmly. But I'm glad to know these things. I suspected, of course. The signs were there. The worn clothing, the hunger in your eyes when you look at food, the exhaustion that goes beyond normal student fatigue. His perception unsettled her. She'd worked so hard to appear normal, to hide the precariousness of her existence. I don't want pity, she said more sharply than intended. Pity? Thomas looked genuinely surprised. My dear girl, what I feel is not pity. It's admiration. To pursue education under such circumstances, to maintain your grades while working. That shows extraordinary character. The timer in the kitchen chimed, saving Ellie from having to respond to praise she didn't know how to accept. Ah, dinner, Thomas said, rising. Nothing elaborate, just beef stew. It seemed appropriate for the weather. I hope you'll join me. The stew was rich and hearty, served with crusty bread still warm from the oven. Ellie tried to eat slowly, to show some restraint, but it had been so long since she'd had a proper home-cooked meal that manners eventually surrendered to hunger. There's plenty more, Thomas encouraged, already refilling her bowl before she could ask. And apple cobbler for dessert if you have room. You didn't have to go to all this trouble, Ellie said, embarrassed by her appetite yet unable to refuse more food. Cooking for one is rather joyless. Having company is a treat for me. He broke off a piece of bread. Besides, I always make too much. Old habits from from before. The unfinished thought hung between them. From when his daughter was alive, Ellie assumed. From when he had a family to cook for. Tell me about your granddaughter, she said impulsively. The one you're still looking for, Thomas stilled, the piece of bread halfway to his mouth. For a moment, she thought he might refuse to answer, might change the subject as he had before. But instead, he set the bread down and reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small, worn photograph. This is the only picture I have of her, he said, passing it across the table. It was taken shortly after her first birthday. The photo showed a toddler with wispy blonde curls and serious eyes, sitting on the lap of a young woman whose smile seemed forced, shadows beneath her eyes suggesting exhaustion or illness. They sat on the steps of what appeared to be an apartment building, autumn leaves scattered around their feet. My daughter Eleanor sent it to me. The last communication I ever received from her. His voice caught. She wrote on the back, "This is your granddaughter. Her name is Eleanor Rose after Mom. She'll never know you, but at least you can know she exists." Ellie's hand trembled as she turned the photograph over. There it was, in faded blue ink, words written in a hand somehow familiar yet completely unknown to her. She looked back at the child in the photo, searching for something recognizable, some connection to the face she saw in the mirror each day. "When was this taken?" she asked, voice barely audible over the storm outside. "October 1999, Thomas replied. "Eleanor Rose would be 22 now. About your age." The room seemed to tilt, the comfortable warmth suddenly stifling. Ellie stared at the photo, at the woman, at her mother, younger than Ellie had ever seen her in pictures, but unmistakably her. "My mother's maiden name was Carraway," she whispered. "Eleanor Carraway. She changed it to James when I was born. She never told me why." Thomas's face drained of color, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What are you saying?" "I think," Ellie swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "I think I'm your granddaughter." For a long moment, neither moved. The fire crackled in the hearth, the storm howled beyond the windows, and two souls stared at each other across a lifetime of separation. "It can't be," Thomas finally said, his voice breaking. "After all this time. It can't be this simple." "Simple?" Ellie laughed, the sound bordering on hysteria. "Is that what you call a random encounter at a street crossing? Me helping an old man who turns out to be my grandfather? That's not simple, that's impossible." "Not impossible," Thomas whispered. "Improbable, perhaps. But in physics, even the most improbable event has a non-zero chance of occurring." He rose from his chair, moving with a caution that suggested he feared she might bolt. Slowly, he opened a drawer in the sideboard, removing a small wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl. "If you are my Eleanor Rose," he said, setting the box before her, "then you should have this." With trembling fingers, Ellie lifted the lid. Inside lay a locket. Gold, in the shape of a heart, its surface etched with tiny stars. Her breath caught. "My star necklace," she whispered. "Mom gave it to me on my 10th birthday." Said it had been hers as a girl. Her eyes filled with tears. I had to sell it 3 years ago. The foster family I was with, they weren't giving me enough food. I was so hungry. Thomas made a sound of pure anguish, a noise she'd never heard from a human being before, something between a sob and a groan, as if his very soul were crying out. I found it in a pawn shop, he said, voice raw. I check them all everywhere I go. Looking for this? For any trace? I've been searching for so long. He opened the locket with practiced care. Inside was a photo she'd never seen, a much younger Thomas holding a baby, his face alight with joy, and beside them a woman with kind eyes and Ellie's own smile. Your grandmother, Thomas explained. My Catherine. She died when your mother was 16. Perhaps that's when everything started to go wrong between us. I didn't know how to be both mother and father to a teenage girl. I made so many mistakes. Ellie touched the tiny photograph, this piece of her history she'd never known existed. Mom never talked about her childhood. Whenever I asked about grandparents, she'd change the subject. I assumed they must have been terrible people. Not terrible, Thomas said quietly. Just one foolish old man too stubborn to accept that his daughter needed to make her own choices, even if they were mistakes. He looked up, eyes searching her face. There are ways to be certain, of course. DNA tests. But I knew the moment you said your name was Eleanor Rose. I think part of me knew even at that street corner, though I couldn't allow myself to hope. That's why you offered to help me with physics, Ellie realized. Why you've been so kind. I would have helped any student who showed your determination, Thomas said firmly. But yes, something about you called to me from the first moment. Your eyes, they're Catherine's eyes exactly. And the way you tilt your head when you're thinking hard about a problem, that's your mother. That's my Eleanor. The storm raged outside, but inside a different kind of tempest was brewing, a lifetime of questions finding answers, of empty spaces suddenly filled with meaning. Ellie stood, needing distance, needing air, needing to process the impossible reality unfolding around her. I need some time, she said, backing toward the doorway. It's too much. Thomas nodded, making no move to follow her. Of course. There's a guest room upstairs, second door on the right. Fresh towels in the bathroom across the hall. Take all the time you need. The guest room was clearly prepared for her arrival, the bed turned down, a carafe of water on the nightstand, even a new toothbrush still in its packaging beside the sink in the adjoining bathroom. Such simple considerations, yet they undid her completely. When was the last time anyone had anticipated her needs? Had prepared a space just for her? Sitting on the edge of the bed, Ellie held the locket in her palm, its weight surprisingly substantial for something so small. In this very house her mother had grown up, had slept perhaps in this very room, had fought with her father, with Ellie's grandfather, and had chosen to cut him from their lives so completely that Ellie never knew he existed. Why? What could have been so unforgivable? Sleep eluded her, questions circling like hungry wolves. Near dawn, exhaustion finally pulled her under. Dreams filled with street crossings that never ended, with reaching hands that couldn't quite connect. She woke to sunlight streaming through curtains she'd forgotten to close, the storm having passed in the night. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. The unfamiliar room, the comfortable bed so different from her own lumpy mattress. Then memory flooded back, and with it, a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation. Downstairs, she found Thomas in the kitchen, orchestrating what appeared to be a breakfast feast: pancakes, bacon, scrambled eggs, fresh fruit cut into precise pieces. He looked up at her footsteps, his expression carefully neutral, giving her space to set the tone. You didn't have to cook all this, she said, hovering in the doorway. I wasn't sure what you liked. He gestured to the spread. So I made options. The awkwardness of the moment, this man who was her grandfather yet still nearly a stranger, might have been unbearable if not for the earnest hope in his eyes. Ellie moved to the stove, picking up a spatula to flip a pancake that was on the verge of burning. Mom made heart-shaped pancakes on special days, she said, the memory surfacing unbidden. Valentine's Day, my birthday, whenever I got an A on a big test, said it was a family tradition. Thomas's breath caught. Catherine started that. When Eleanor, your mother, was just a little girl. They worked side by side, finishing the breakfast preparations in a silence that gradually shifted from awkward to companionable. By the time they sat down to eat, some of the tension had eased. I have questions, Ellie said finally, pushing a piece of pancake around her plate. About Mom. About what happened between you. Thomas set down his fork. I'll answer everything I can. You deserve the truth, all of it." And so, over cooling coffee and half-eaten breakfast, Thomas Carraway told the story of his daughter's estrangement, of a brilliant young art history student who fell in love with a charismatic musician, of a father's fears that his daughter was throwing away her future, of arguments that grew more bitter until unforgivable words were spoken on both sides. "I told her she was making the biggest mistake of her life," Thomas admitted, shame evident in his voice, that if she chose him, she shouldn't bother coming back when it all fell apart. "I thought, God help me, I thought I was protecting her, giving her an ultimatum that would force her to see reason. But she chose him," Ellie said softly. "She chose him. Left that very night. I didn't hear from her for nearly 2 years until that photograph arrived. No return address, just the picture and that note." He stared into his coffee. "I hired private investigators. I searched myself every weekend, every break between semesters. But she'd changed her name, and without knowing your father's identity—" "James Wilson," Ellie supplied. "That's what's on my birth certificate, but he was long gone before I was born. Mom said he took off as soon as he learned she was pregnant." Thomas closed his eyes briefly, absorbing this confirmation of his worst fears. "By the time I learned your mother had passed, an obituary in a small local paper that one of my search alerts caught, you had already been in the system for months. The foster care bureaucracy. It's designed to protect children, but it also makes finding someone nearly impossible without legal standing. You never stopped looking," Ellie said, not a question but a realization. "Never." His voice was firm. "Not for a single day." The truth of his dedication was evident in the house around them, a home preserved as if waiting for someone to return, in the weather-worn face of a man who walked campus pathways daily in hopes of glimpsing a familiar feature in a passing student, in the carefully maintained collection of Eleanor Carraway's childhood art that Ellie discovered later that day in what had been her mother's bedroom. The blizzard kept them housebound for 3 days, a forced intimacy that might have been uncomfortable, but instead became a gift, time to begin bridging the chasm of 20 years of separation, to share stories and memories, to grieve together for the woman they had both loved and lost. On the morning of the 4th day, when streets were finally cleared enough for safe travel, Thomas drove Ellie to her apartment building. Neither spoke as they climbed the narrow stairs to the 3rd floor, but Thomas's expression darkened with each step, each sign of neglect and disrepair. The apartment itself was even worse than the stairwell, water damage on the ceiling from melting snow, the persistent cold despite utilities having been restored, the stark evidence of Ellie's precarious existence laid bare under Thomas's gaze. "You can't stay here," he said finally, watching as she gathered textbooks and the few personal possessions she couldn't bear to leave. "It's not safe. It's not healthy. I don't have much choice," Ellie replied, zipping her backpack. "The lease runs through May. You have a choice now." Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. "Come live with me. There's plenty of room, and it's senseless for you to struggle here when I have a home half empty and waiting." Ellie hesitated, pride warring with practicality. I need to pay my way. I'm not looking for handouts." "It's not charity to help family," Thomas said, "but if it makes you more comfortable, we can discuss terms. Perhaps you could help around the house. My knees aren't what they once were, and the garden has been sadly neglected these past few years." The word family vibrated between them, new and fragile yet undeniably true. Ellie looked around the tiny apartment that had never really felt like home, at the water-stained ceiling and the makeshift desk, at the single burner that served as her kitchen. "Okay," she said finally, "but I'll still work at the coffee shop. And I'll contribute what I can." Thomas's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "Of course. Your independence is important. I would expect nothing less from Eleanor Rose Carraway." The name, her full name, her true name, settled around her shoulders like a cloak, warm and somehow right. Moving took less than 2 hours. Everything Ellie owned fit into 3 boxes and a suitcase. Thomas insisted on hiring movers despite the minimal load, treating her meager possessions with a dignity they'd never been afforded. In the weeks that followed, life transformed with breathtaking speed. A proper desk appeared in what was now undeniably her room, along with bookshelves that Thomas helped her fill with texts both required and aspirational. The kitchen became a place of shared meals and late-night conversations, of Thomas teaching her family recipes and Ellie introducing him to the simple comfort foods her mother had made when money was tight. Winter mellowed into spring, crocuses pushing through melting snow in the garden they tended together. Ellie's grades improved dramatically, partly from Thomas's tutoring, partly from the simple fact that she was now properly fed and rested, no longer working herself to exhaustion just to survive. On a mild afternoon in late April, as they planted tomato seedlings in the freshly turned soil, Thomas cleared his throat in the way he did when approaching a difficult subject. "I've been thinking," he began, patting soil around a delicate plant. "About your education?" Ellie straightened, wiping her hands on her jeans. "What about it?" "Your scholarship covers tuition, but there are other expenses. Books, supplies, proper winter clothing." He focused intently on the seedling, not meeting her eyes. "I'd like to help with those things. Thomas, please hear me out." He looked up then, eyes earnest behind his glasses. "I have savings. Quite substantial savings, in fact. I've lived frugally all these years, and a professor's salary goes rather far when one has no family to support. The money has just accumulated." "I can't take your money," Ellie protested, though with less conviction than she might have months ago. "It was always meant for you," Thomas said quietly. "Or rather for my granddaughter. For your education, your future. I've been setting it aside since the day I received that photograph, hoping that someday I would find you." He reached for another seedling. "And now I have, by what you might call cosmic coincidence and I might call providence." Ellie was silent, absorbing his words, watching a robin pull a worm from the freshly turned earth nearby. "You don't have to decide now," Thomas continued. "Just know that the option exists. And regardless of your decision, this is your home for as long as you wish it to be." Home. The word resonated deep within her, filling spaces she hadn't realized were empty. This house with its creaky floors and sun-dappled rooms, its shelves of books and walls of memories, it had become home in a way no place had been since her mother died. "Thank you," she said finally, the words inadequate but heartfelt. "For everything." Thomas nodded, understanding all she couldn't yet express. They returned to their planting, working side by side as afternoon shadows lengthened across the garden. That evening, as stars emerged in the deepening blue of twilight, they sat on the porch swing that Thomas had repaired specifically because Ellie had mentioned her mother had always wanted one. The rhythmic creaking, the gentle sway, created a cocoon of tranquility around them. "I've been thinking too," Ellie said, breaking the comfortable silence. "About names." Thomas turned slightly toward her, encouraging but not pushing. "I've been Ellie James my whole life," she continued. "It's on all my documents, my school records. But it's not who I really am, is it? Who you are isn't defined by a name on paper," Thomas said gently. "No, but names are important. They connect us to our past, to our family." She traced a pattern on the wooden armrest. "I'd like to change mine. Legally. To Eleanor Rose Caraway." The sharp intake of breath beside her conveyed more than words could: surprise, joy, a profound gratitude that transcended ordinary expression. "Are you certain?" Thomas asked, voice thick with emotion. "It's a significant step." "I'm certain." Eleanor, looked up at the emerging stars, at the constellations her mother had taught her, the same stars her grandfather had likely pointed out to her mother decades ago. "It's who I've always been. I just didn't know it until now." Thomas's hand found hers, warm and steady, a bridge across generations. "Eleanor Rose Caraway," he said, the name a benediction on his lips. "My granddaughter, found at last." In the quiet of the spring evening, surrounded by the scent of newly turned earth and budding flowers, Eleanor felt the last pieces of herself clicking into place. Not just a student, not just a survivor, but a granddaughter, an heir to stories and traditions she was only beginning to discover. The poor student who had helped an old man cross the street had found, in that simple act of kindness, the family she had never known she lost. And under the watchful gaze of eternal stars, two souls once separated by circumstance, pride, and time continued their journey together. One road, one family, one second chance neither had dared to hope for, but both had somehow always deserved.